Okay. Hello, everybody. Settle down. So yeah, welcome to this bonus week. Thank you for showing up. So because this class doesn't have a class the first week of the semester, because semester starts on Wednesday, it's like this weird little half week is kind of part of that. So appreciate you showing up. If you're watching this on a video and you didn't show up, I understand. And what was I going to say? Yeah, so it was kind of the cadence of the semester has actually been working out pretty nicely. So last time we had the fun little walkthrough of my prior research experience with sort of hypothetically sufficient background to cover it. And now this is the second to final class of the semester. And yeah, so it's kind of like a little bit of a bonus lecture. And so, like I said, so this time I'm going to talk about your autonomic nervous system, and particularly as it relates to such things as trauma and the neurophysiological effects of trauma on the body, and the sort of the ways that kind of like interacts and overlaps with all the things we've been learning this semester about how bodies work and the weird balancing act that we have between like the parts of our bodies and nervous system that we have direct, hypothetically, direct volitional access and control, and the parts that are kind of like the ocean that we float on top of, and sort of like the ways that those things play in with each other. So next week is going to be the final class of the semester. There is no proper final, so I'm going to spend that time kind of doing wrap up and just presenting my class project of trying to make sense of the tremendous amount of data y'all have put into the server. I'll come up with the basic plan for I'll have like some kind of like a official assignment looking thing on Canvas about like what to do to kind of wrap up your efforts here. And I'll spend Thanksgiving kind of putting a couple little extra bells and whistles on the bot and sort of like some of the visualizations I've been showing throughout the semester. And then there'll be some kind of assignment-like object that will look something like, hey, make sure you've had at least this many chats here and there. And then a kind of like an outro type of conversation where you'll have kind of like an introductory aspect. And so there's going to be kind of like an exit interview type of thing where you'll talk to the bot about. At that point, I will have, with any luck, a way of like extracting your specific conversations and sort of doping that into the conversation. And then you can kind of like discuss with the bot about like the blah, blah, blahs of how the semester went and what you discovered and found, and it'll be fun to look at. Yeah, so let's get into this. So I dropped a link to the sort of the sloppy notes that I have on the GitHub page. And kind of try to go through this let's see what we're trying to do here. See that? Yeah, sure, why not? That's fine. Yeah, so gonna try to just like run through a lot of this. This was kind of, so this area of neuroscience at the sort of the autonomic level is not something that I have like direct professional experience in. So a lot of the stuff we've been talking about this semester is on the kind of the perceptual motor side of life, and like eye movements and motion capture and that kind of biomechanic-y stuff. And that is an area which I am a like contributing expert or whatever in that particular area of research. So I have I have the awareness of that field in the sense of like, knowing the literature and also like understanding the methods and sort of like being very steeped in the culture of people who research that type of thing. This is getting closer, and this is getting into areas that like I don't have that same relationship with. So it's stuff that I kind of know a lot about in various ways, but the ways in which I know it is kind of like some like a strange middle ground between like what we often call like sort of the concept of like an intelligent layperson, which is someone who's not a professional expert in a particular field, but it's just kind of like a smart person who's like looked into it and read up about it. A lot of sort of scientific writing is sort of intentionally targeting that sort of intelligent layperson type of audience. So it's like I've read some books about it, but I haven't like done deep research on it. I've never done like direct research in the area, but it has this nice aspect because of my background that all the sort of the popular science type of stuff I like to look into about it is connected to stuff that I do have that kind of deep knowledge of. So sort of you can like poke around and sort of like watch throughout the lecture about like the kind of the ways that like the stuff that we have been talking about kind of folds in, and it's kind of interesting for me to kind of examine like the places where it feels like because I'm not in that area, I'm sort of missing some things, and other ways in which because I am kind of an outsider to some extent, like a nearby outsider, that the unique perspectives that I have kind of like oh, that might actually be a contribution into that type of thing. So yeah, let's get into it. Yeah, and so let's talk about your various nervous systems. You have one main one, which is roughly speaking your entire body, and then there's several other kind of delineations of your nervous system. And the ones that we've been talking about the most, the ones that we tend to talk about the most in the field that we call neuroscience, is the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the sort of the thing that you tend to think about when you think about neuroscience. Central nervous system. And specifically, it is sort of this big lumpy pink thing on top that we call the brain, the cortex, and then the peripheral nervous system is the other sort of side of that. So the central nervous system it's your cortex, which is the pink wrinkly bit on top, and it's also lumped together with the subcortical regions, which is like your cerebellum, which is a little bumpy bit on the back. Subcortical areas like we talk about basal ganglia and thalamus and sort of those parts that are kind of like wrapped up inside of the big pink wrinkly bit, and also your spine and things like that. So these are the areas that we sort of the basic functional delineation we tend to put for the central nervous system is that it's the area where quote unquote processing occurs, where information that has sort of come in through the senses is kind of like chunked around and sort of changed form and then often kind of turned into the bases of a motor behavior, a motor action. But of course, that distinction, like everything here, is a cartoon version of reality. It's a pretty reasonable cleave point to split things apart into, but it has all sorts of overlaps and gray areas, as nature tends to do. Particular in areas like the eye, like in your retina, or arguably in sort of like the weird cacophony of sensors on your skin. There's stuff that would presumably normally be put into like the peripheral nervous system, the sort of the sensory and motor aspects of the nervous system, that really do things that kind of resemble what we would call computations. The immediate distinction between the central nervous system as the thing, so like this cartoon right here, where you have the central nervous system is this wonderful little off-center brain-like shape, and then the spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system is all the little, sort of like often kind of pejoratively thought of as like, just like the wiring. So the things that bring sensory information from the external parts of your body into the central nervous system, and the sort of flip-flopped wires that send motor commands from the central nervous system out to the periphery. So this is the sort of cartoon version that you'll often see in textbooks. And it's not wrong, it's not incorrect, it's not a bad way to describe things, but it's sort of inherently incomplete and cartoonified sort of in the way that we often do when we try to parse nature, which, as we've discussed in many ways and many days, is a sort of classically impossible thing to do. And so central versus peripheral nervous system, that's mostly what we've been talking about here, and that kind of basic distinction there. But there are other kind of like sub-distinctions that we can make into other sort of aspects of the sort of all the different sort of nerve groups that we find in the body. So generally speaking, neuroscience is sort of the science of neurons, and your neurons sort of sit in these sort of different functional roles in your body. And I'm realizing kind of like as I was saying this, that like even this distinction that I'm about to make is also kind of like a chopped up version of reality. So kind of when I sat down to write these notes, I was like, oh yeah, you got your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, and then you've got the enteric nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. But I realized kind of like as I was showing this that those could arguably be just, you could think of them as like 4 distinct things, or you could consider them to be like subcategories of the 2 things that I just mentioned. Or you could just say language is incomplete and we sort of name things as they are useful to us. So central nervous system, peripheral nervous, so broadly speaking, central nervous system is like the central processor and the main computational aspects of your neurons. Peripheral nervous system is kind of like sensory motor components. Enteric nervous system, which is a word that I learned this morning, is the fancy term for your gut, which is one of those areas that kind of like, I remember when I started in grad school around 2008 was when I think people kind of started to really understand that your gut is really like its own kind of thing. Like there's a lot going on in the way that the nerves are connected and sort of, who decides like when various tubes will start doing peristalsis and which gland should secrete what into which area at which time, and all that kind of like, not to mention like the microbiome that's going on. And so that as the sort of complexity of that sort of gut nervous system has sort of been slowly becoming aware in the sort of like the scientific research community, it has also been kind of like percolating out into the sort of the world at large. And so all the things that you're seeing about your gut health and your microbiome and stuff like that it's sort of right on schedule. It's sort of showing up like a decade or so after it started to sort of come up in the scientific literature. So I don't have as much to say about the enteric nervous system, but it will come back into the conversation because it interacts with the autonomic nervous system in a way that's kind of like interesting. We'll talk about sort of closer to the bottom there. And then the last bit, the sort of the star of the show today, which is your autonomic nervous system. Auto is sort of, like the root of automatic. And your autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that handles like the basics, like the sort of the keep you alive stuff, the kind of the low level, like what do you need to survive as an individual organism as well as a species type of system. I've talked about, I think I mentioned at some point in this, that the nervous system, particularly in the central area. And the distinction I mentioned before, like, there might be folks out there who would argue that the enteric nervous system is sort of a subcomponent of the peripheral nervous system, which who knows if they would be able to defend that position to relevant experts. But the same people who like to chop things up into subcategories would also place the autonomic nervous system as a subcomponent of the central nervous system. And let's see if I can. Brainstem. And so oftentimes when you look at the brain and the sort of the central nervous system and that kind of stuff, you can kind of get a map of how the sort of the phylogenetic history of that part of the nervous system by going from the inside out. So as you sort of from the sort of the innermost part of your nervous system is typically the oldest part. And then as you sort of like go outward, kind of like the layers of an onion or a flower or something like that, the stuff that you see on the outside edges of everything tends to be the most recently developed, the most, the neocerebellum. This pink wrinkly bit is sometimes called the neocerebellum. It's the new part of the cerebellum. The neocortex, the new part of the cortex. And then the same kind of story is true in smaller scale, although smaller scale in terms of volume, but larger scale in terms of number of neurons at the cerebellum level, where there is a similar kind of distinction between the middle parts are the oldest parts, and as you sort of go outward, you get the more phylogenetically new parts, and then the outside is the neocerebellum, which is the part that it's thought to be associated with like tool use and like the really fine motor control that we are good at. And so as we're talking about things like the autonomic nervous system, we're talking really about like these inside parts, like the really deep down parts, like closer to your things like your brainstem and your medulla oblongata. And it kind of lives in this space of like, if you think of your central controller as a kind of like, it's like a fist, like this is your like your spine coming down, and then the fist thing on top, that's where most of the really deep down subcortical regions tend to live. And these tend to be the very, very old aspects of your nervous system. And then the cortex is sort of described it at one point as like, it's kind of like the flower on top of the bush. Like if you think of like a rose bush, there's this beautiful red part on the top. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the beautiful red flower on top of the rose bush, but really when you look at the actual plant, it's mostly bush, and then the flower is just kind of this really neat, interesting aspect. But strictly speaking, that bush without a rose would still be able to do most of the normal bush things that it needs to do, minus creating more bushes, I think. Just my botany tends to break down in this area. And so there's kind of, this is also where you'll often hear kind of conversations around like the mammalian brain versus like your reptile brain, where the pink wrinkly cortex bit is the part that tends to be associated with your mammal bits. And then the deep down parts is the stuff that we tend to associate with like the reptilian parts, because those guys evolved, much longer ago. But they like are the rest of all the rest that I'm aware of our vertebrate friends, they share a lot of similar basic functionalities in terms of like having a heart, having a nervous system, and having a centralized set of neurons that are that run most of the show. This is in sort of opposition to things like insects or cephalopods like octopus and stuff like that, where they have a more distributed nervous system, where you don't have the same kind of distinction between like this like high concentration of important parts in the middle and then sort of this more diffuse set of responsibilities in the periphery. All of our vertebrate friends, especially our tetrapod, sort of 2 arms, 2 legs friends, tend to have a similar sort of, that's sort of like the terminus of the vertebra of the spinal cord. So all of our chordata friends have a similar shape there. And yeah, so the autonomic nervous system handles what the sort of the basic needs for survival, and it is at this point that I get to make a joke which all neuroscience professors are required to make in undergraduate classrooms, which is to say that the ANS handles the 4 F's of survival, which is feeding, fighting, fleeing, and procreation is the classic joke. And that is sort of the basic idea of like, these are the things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to eat food, you need to be able to fight when you have to, run away when you have to, and then do the complex behaviors that sort of proliferate the species. And the autonomic nervous system is sort of the part that tends to, is thought to handle a lot of that. And as we are chopping things up into increasingly small boxes, your autonomic nervous system is also, in a cartoonified version of the world, considered to involve 2 main aspects, which we tend to refer to. Actually, I found, even though I do a lot of this where I looking up images, I just like searched Google Images for like the topic in question, which always feels a little bit lazy, but also kind of like I like sort of showing the process a bit. And I find it especially helpful in this case because you get to see just different types of cartoons, and this is going to become relevant with the next search. Like most of these are pretty okay, but you get to see kind of like the different ways that we tend to talk about these things and the different sort of pictures we tend to use to describe these things. And some of them have greater or lesser detail, and some of them have more or less resemblance to sort of like the actual thing that you might see if you were to take that organism and chop it and take pictures of it, whereas others are far more cartoonified. But I think it's really important to notice that all of these are cartoons. None of these are accurate, and none of these represent what you would see if you chopped up any actual human, and certainly don't represent what you would see if you chopped up all possible humans, which I don't recommend doing either of those things. But it's sort of like, I think we tend to have, we very naturally, I think, tend towards this fiction that there's sort of, that these pictures somehow represent reality. And really they represent the best approximation we have for sort of carving up reality into conceptual boxes that are simple enough for us to be able to wrap our heads around. And in the same way that, you know, this cartoon of the brain has less details than this cartoon of the brain, but they're both cartoons, and they both sort of have these like false separations of this thing, this part is that color, this part is that color. We call this part the parietal lobe and this part the occipital lobe. And we don't draw these colors in random places for no reason, but we also sort of must always remember that like we put these words into nature. We didn't crack open the brain and see a stamp that said this is the parietal lobe. We just discovered that if we call this thing the certain thing, then we can say stuff about the whole region which tends to be more true than it would be if we talked about a different part of the brain. So the occipital lobe is where the visual cortex lives. And so if we talk about vision, we're mostly talking about here. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to find vision-y stuff in other parts of the nervous system. You absolutely will. So that's, yeah. And as there's going to be a particular search that is going to show a very stark distinction between like scientific-y stuff and the kind of like woo-woo stuff. Like a lot of what we're going to be getting towards really touches on woo, like the sort of the like, getting into the kind of like from the edge of like what you might call like proper science, which I wouldn't recommend, down to like popular conceptions of science and down to like what we might call pseudoscience, which is sort of not, doesn't track scientific understanding in the same way that we would hope things like more popular science approximations do. Where popular science is like this kind of stuff. Like it's, I would even argue that things like undergraduate textbooks on neuroscience are on the edge of popular science because they are the versions of the story that we tell to people who don't have a lot of background in the region and wouldn't benefit from sort of seeing the way that it tends to be worked on in professional level, where it's just much more murky and messy and sort of less coherent. So we tend to start with different layers of cartoonification, and then we sort of try to slowly back you into the reality of the world, which is far more chaotic and mixed up. So, autonomic nervous system is the two sort of main aspects and branches of that are what we tend to refer to as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. And those, again, cartoonified distinction tends to be stuff that we associate with the, on the one side you have your fight or flight aspects, sort of the cranked up, high speed, getting into a fight type of aspects of inhabiting a body which must survive in a world wherein predation has evolved. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we tend to refer to as the rest and relax aspects of our nervous system. And that's the part of, sleeping, digesting food, feeling calm, those kinds of things. And the way, as I was sort of looking into the deeper aspects of this area, doing things like reading, like scanning review articles, like reading the Wikipedia page, which I always recommend for any new domain, and just kind of like checking the things that I think I know and seeing if I can find some connection to more established research. There is, as often is the case, a lot of shifting around in the way that we tend to think about the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic parasympathetic divide and who has what role and how should we think about them, and is it like, and so when I talk about this, I'm going to be trying to sort of do an appropriate mixing of like, yeah, I'll try to appropriately elevate the things that I would mostly say about it, which tends to be the older stuff, with what I'm picking up appears to be kind of like most of the shift towards the new ways of thinking. And in general, anytime I talk about something that seems simple, that's the stuff that it's never that simple. So anytime I say something like, here's the autonomic nervous system, there's two parts, this one and that one does this and this one does that. All of those kind of like hard delineations and hard labelings and sort of, simplified division of labor, that's the stuff where if you actually poked at it and dug into it, the answer is always going to be that it's more complicated than that, and that those are just, those are the cartoon stories that we tell because it's a combination of what we used to think, which we tend to used to think that things were simpler than we have found them out to be. And also that is the distinction that we tend to start with when we're explaining things to people, because it's not always, it's not the most functional thing to just start every conversation with, it's too complex to understand in 15 lifetimes. So we tend to start with the cartoons. So the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, rest or relax. We'll stick with that rough delineation for now. Very hard to remember these things. This is one of the many areas of science, especially neuroscience, where some asshole a couple hundred years ago decided to name the two things words that sound almost exactly the same, like afferent and efferent for the sensory versus motor nerves, which I still don't know which one is which. I think afferent happens after the event, so it's the sensory, and then efferent affects the world, so it's the motor. But I'll bet they thought they were so clever when they came up with that, and I'll hate them forever. So we tend to rely on mnemonics for that. And so my particular mnemonic for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems is that the sympathetic is the fight or flight one, because you're just beat the guy up and now you're sympathetic for them, versus the parasympathetic because you're like eating a pear and you're relaxing and eating a pear. It's not a good mnemonic, but it's the best one I've got. I realized as I was doing this that like the bot would probably be spectacular at mnemonics. So as some percentage of you go off to medical school and are forced to memorize things, which I personally am allowed to skim through, that might be a pretty good use of that technology. So we have sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is the fight or flight, and one of the distinctions that I came across when I was looking into this was that one of the ways that we have started to add some complexity to that basic fight or flight versus rest and relax is that perhaps a better way to think of it is that your sympathetic nervous system is the part that is tuned for high speed, fast paced, sort of low latency actions that require like arousal and typically the activation of like your musculoskeletal system in order to react to the world at a very short time scale. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is the part that handles the slower, calmer, quieter processes that sort of play out over long periods of time. Things like digestion and sleeping and stuff like that versus like getting into a fight or something like that. And then of course there are many aspects of our behavior that require some combination of both. So like think about like playing sports or something like that, where good performance requires this combination of really fast and precise action with a calmness that allows you to sort of avoid going into kind of like panicky state. And there are various other socio-personal, physiological processes that similarly require a complex balance of arousal and relaxation. So when you look up these autonomic nervous system, you see a lot of pictures like this, where you say parasympathetic does this, sympathetic system does that, sympathetic system attaches to these parts of your body, and your parasympathetic attaches to these parts, and of course, in many ways, it's like these are reasonable things to say. I also really like the autonomic nervous system in the wiki page. We'll talk about the pictures in a second here. But there's some nice tables, a lot of physiology stuff, which never, in my area of research, I tend to be able to avoid in learning too much specifics about this type of thing. But these letters and numbers are vertebrae, and sort of where they tend, T6, T7, T8. That's your the sixth and seventh and eighth vertebrae of your thoracic region versus you have your cervical and your thoracic and your lumbar and blah blah blah. Then down here in the function, you get these nice sort of lists here. Typically, the aspects of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, they tend to be paired with one another. And so the parasympathetic connection to your gut starts digestion and starts peristalsis and secretion of various goops into various places. And your sympathetic nervous system tends to shut that down. In the sense that if you're going to get into a fight, you don't want to be wasting a bunch of energy digesting stuff. And similarly, sort of as you sort of look at these, a lot of these things you can think of as distinction between the stuff that you have to do to generally survive, being turned on by your parasympathetic nervous system, and the things that are sort of that, the optional subsystems that you would want to turn off if you were in a fight or flight sort of environment, being activated by the sympathetic nervous system. You don't digest things when you're in a fight. It's sort of, we're not operating at that time scale right now, we'll digest this later, is the basic thought. And there are some interesting connections, which we will get back to if I manage my time properly, around things like your eyes and your iris and your sort of your pupil constriction and things like that. And I discovered this fun, interesting thing that parasympathetic affects the lens inside of your eye, that part that you can sort of if you look at something and fuzz out, make the world defocus, you're controlling the lens inside of your eye. And those muscles are sort of interact with that sympathetic parasympathetic divide in an interesting way. So back to the cartoons, there are some particular anatomical aspects of your nervous system that sort of tend to be associated with with the sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of your body. And this would be the place where if you were on the side of saying that the ANS is not a part of your central nervous system, you would point to these anatomical features to say, see, look, this thing lives outside of the spine, so it's part of the peripheral or it's, I wouldn't want to say it's part of the peripheral, but it's definitely not part of the central because it's outside of your spine, but it's very close to that, so it's hard to say quite what, so the argument continues. And in particular, your sympathetic nervous system is related to an interesting aspect called the sympathetic trunk, which are pairs of ganglia that live sort of that run down the edge of your spine on the outside. So ganglia is just a cluster of neurons. We talk about the retinal ganglion cells that sort of pool together different photoreceptors. A lot of things like insects and sort of creatures that don't have a central nervous system, they do tend to have ganglia. So with things like dragonfly, they have a ganglion bulbs that handle the visual inputs and motor outputs. Which then when you start asking the question of, well, what's the difference between a ganglion and a central nervous system? It's well, that's where we're getting into linguistics, so it's not really defined. But let me find, sympathetic trunk. So these little bulbules of neurons that sort of run down your spine, that's the sort of the home of where your sympathetic nervous system tends to interact with your body. And let's see. And it's sort of like, it runs like from so this is that sort of knob thing on the top. This is down into so this is L5, which is like right around here. And then, so this is it's called the caudus equinus at the bottom here because it looks like a horse tail. And so all down the spine, you have these sort of paired sets of ganglion bulbs, which is the stuff that we tend to associate with the sympathetic nervous system. And these bulbs get activated and sort of they start that trade-off from, oh, I think we might be in a fight. Oh, I think we need to sort of ramp up the general activation of the nervous system. And these parts, these ganglion cells handle that kind of like that cranking up of arousal. And I think about this a lot. So in the same way that we have to be careful about thinking about these cartoonified versions of the nervous system and the body and biology in general, you also have to be careful doing the thing that I'm about to do, which is starting to like use your own personal experience of being inside of one of these weird meat puppets to make sense of some of the stuff that you see in terms of the anatomy. You have to be careful about it, but you don't have to be that careful about it. Because if you think about what the sympathetic nervous system does, is it tends to be a part of like being startled, being scared, being like, oh my God, there's something over there. One of my favorite nervous system responses, which is the startle reflex, which is a part of our nervous system that we share with houseflies, which is like large looming object, and you kind of have that jump thing. And for me, there's this strong association between those types of startle responses and like lightning going down your spine. There's kind of like a shocking moment. And I was very sort of fascinated to discover when I was learning about this stuff, sort of, I would say I'm a little bit embarrassingly late as in my career as a neuroscientist, partially because I started as a philosophy major, so I missed a lot of the standard undergraduate introduction stuff. And sort of just realizing that, like, because what these things are doing is they're doing things like telling your body to dump adrenaline. They're cranking up your muscles and increasing the sensitivities and, you know, like lowering pain sensitivities and increasing like sort of like low level activation so you can respond quicker to stimuli. That kind of like the Wolverine kind of like response comes from these things sort of getting cranked on. And that cranking on, of course, that I'm describing like a very high level of crank, but sort of the somatic experience of having this kind of like lightning running down your spine associated with those sort of startle responses, and then it's like academically learning that startle response is associated with a set of paired ganglion cells that run down your spine. It's one of those things that's like, is that the same thing, or am I just telling stories to myself? Is there a difference between those things and the cartoons we see here? Who knows? But yeah, so from an anatomical perspective, the sympathetic nervous system is associated with these paired spinal ganglion cells in the sympathetic trunk. Any other? And if you're wondering what this strange picture here is, it's the same. It's kind of, it's like, there's almost like a subway map aspect to these cartoons where it's like, you know, it doesn't tell you exactly the layout, but like you're gonna hit this. If you're trying to get from this one to this one, you should go in that direction. And you know, you're gonna hit a thing. I think these shapes are associated with like, you know, activation versus inhibition and stuff like that. And you know, this part connects to that part. And actually, no, sorry, these ones up here are more peripheral. But yeah. And so speaking of these blue lines, so the red lines here are the sort of the sympathetic, and then the blue lines here correspond to the parasympathetic. And this is the place where I have to put a big woo disclaimer, because we're now going to start talking about such a thing as the vagus nerve, which is a real thing that exists. It is a real anatomical feature, it's used in a lot of sort of as we're now going to start getting into the space of like how do you calm your nervous system, how do you like relate to the world, and in that region, a lot of people, good-minded, good-hearted people doing their best can often find their ways into ways of explaining the world that sort of blur the line between this is like useful things to tell humans and this is like empirical things that we believe is true about the physical world. And I'll give you a couple hints about how you can like just tell which part of the landscape you're in as you do things like search for the vagal nerve. So vagal nerve is a really neat guy, and it is it's the longest nerve in your body by a very high factor. Vagal is like the same root as like vagrant or like whatever else. Like it means wandering. It's like I was gonna say voyage, but I don't think that's actually the same thing. But it means wandering. Maybe they're the same. I don't know. So the vagal nerve is called the wandering nerve, and it kind of see. So this is a place where like I have to really pick my pictures carefully because a lot of these are cartoons that I wouldn't want to put behind. Like I don't know what this guy. They're missing some really important parts here. This is a nice picture, I think. So the vagus nerve starts. So the sympathetic trunk sort of runs down the spine and sort of has these aspects that sort of go into the spine at the various vertebrae. The vagal nerve starts, it sort of like squirts out of your like your brainstem at the where 1503. I've never cared, but somehow I'm guessing vagal. Cranial nerve X. Structure, I don't know, one of the cranial nerves. Yeah, it's one of the cranial nerves. So for you future doctor types, you will be forced to look at many. This list of cranial nerves will become very familiar to you. Cranial nerves, the optic nerve is one of them. The oculomotor nerves that controls eye movements is one of them. It's basically just the nerves that control your facial expressions are among some of these. And then the vagal nerve is one of them. So it breaks out of your central nervous system in the cranium and then sort of runs down through your body and like wraps around. That's not helpful. Open image. So this is all one neuron, and it has many. So with neurons, like the long parts are called the axons, and then you have. I was going to say dendrites, but I'm not sure if the dendrites are at the beginning or the end. But it's kind of. This is all one long neuron, and it tends to go down, and it wraps around a lot of the viscera of your body, like all the goopy bits in the middle, including your respiratory system, and down into this sort of gut part of your body. And so like earlier when I talked about the enteric nervous system, the sort of the gut-based nervous system, this is its main mode of communication. This is the main mode of communication between your guts and the central nervous system is through this interaction of the vagus nerve, and then similarly to come back to this a little bit more in a second here, but I kind of think similar to the way that the sympathetic trunk I tend to associate with that like shocking feeling of being surprised. You can think about all the different like emotions and feelings that you have that sort of relate to like sinking feelings in your chest or like your guts feeling all tied up or like empty things in the pit of your stomach right here. And I had a similar sort of like reaction when I first saw pictures of this, and I was like, oh yeah, that's where all of those, if I were to point to those feelings, it's like, yeah, these sort of spaghetti cacophonies of parts of the vagus nerve. And yeah, so where are we at with the? Yeah, so those are kind of like, obviously there's many more details, but the yeah, so sorry, so I guess there's some parts that come out the bottom too. I don't know. But yeah, so your vagus nerve has these kind of like, whereas the sympathetic system has it sort of like runs down the spine, your parasympathetic tends to be associated with these sort of like long range connections through the vagus nerve, which sort of are not as connected to the kind of like the musculoskeletal aspects of your body. And so before, when we were looking at that sort of list of different functions, and which part is like what the effect of parasympathetic activation is on these given processes and given organs versus sympathetic, that trade-off is thought to be mediated through what's the word? There's a fancy word for this, but it's like the trade-off type of activation where one of these systems tends to crank up while the other tends to crank down. You get the same kind of effect when I think I talked about this more in some of the subgroups, but in the way that our reflexes trade off when we're doing things like walking, where as I'm walking, my feet are sort of cycling through stance and swing with a very tight spatiotemporal coupling, where as my foot hits the ground, my leg muscles have to be stiff enough and strong enough to support the weight of my body, but then the second my foot leaves the ground, they get all floppy so they can swing through without having to like burn a bunch of energy. And the transition from that stance to swing at the level of your limbs during things like locomotion is mediated from your upper levels of your nervous system through like the top upper part of the motor hierarchy, often through the shifting the gain of different sort of low-level reflexes. So like the stretch reflex that tends to sort of resist motion. That transition from stance to swing from each step is sort of mediated at some level by your higher, I think at that point it's like your cerebellum and that part of the region, shifting how the gain on that low-level stretch reflex is where a lot of that, the stance to swing transitions tend to happen. And there's a similar kind of like reciprocal activation. That's the term I was looking for too. There's a reciprocal activation component of like the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems here. And so like I said, we could teach several classes on the specific anatomy associated with these systems, but in terms of like high-level, broad-cut, cartoonified versions of the story, the main anatomical aspects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are associated with the sympathetic trunk and those sort of paired ganglion cells in the sympathetic case, and then that vagus nerve sort of wandering through your body in the parasympathetic sense. And so moving into sort of a more functional space, the idea there is to sort of like this transition of your nervous system into states of sort of, fight or flight, high pressure, low time scale, leave it all on the field types of activation of your sympathetic nervous system versus those longer time scale, slower, relaxive, restorative aspects as your parasympathetic system takes over. And we're going to talk most of the rest of the class is going to be talking about that transition and your ability to appropriately mediate between the different states that your body should be in given the state of the world that you're in. And specifically, I want to start talking about this in terms of a measurable aspect. So a lot of the research, the behavioral research into these areas of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, looks at things that are typically handled by those by your ANS. The main one being things like your breathing and your heart rate. And specifically your heart rate, because your breathing is obviously an important aspect of survival. It is also available for voluntary control. Like most of the time that your breathing is happening on its own, but you can choose to hold your breath. You can choose to inhale, you can choose to exhale, and you can sort of enact that volitional control to some extent. Like you cannot hold your breath until you die, but you can hold your breath for a good long time. And I don't know if you could pass out by holding your breath, but don't try it. And whereas your heart is sort of less, it's like one layer deeper. Like you cannot control your heart rate in the same way that you control your breath. And you can't control your breath in the same way that you can control your hand. So your heart rate is is like one layer deeper in your nervous system, where you no longer have that kind of direct volitional control. And so looking at that as a measurement becomes a really interesting and valuable sort of window into the status and the functionality that's going on at that layer of your nervous system control. And one of the main sort of concepts that comes out is this notion of heart rate variability. So there is a certain kind of like naive, mechanistic, sort of like robot-brained thinking about the heart, which I believed for quite some time, which was that if you would imagine that if you're a doctor assessing the health of someone's nervous system, you would look at their heart rate and you would look for heart rate variability, and you would say heart rate variability is good when it's low. We like it when our heart beats on a very regular basis and sort of like a metronome, and the variability of timing between beats is low. That's when your heart is doing its job very well. But it turns out that although this is, caveat around this, that actually tends not to be the case. And when we think about things like heart rate variability, one of the things that we look for, as if I was a medical type of doctor, is there is a healthy range of variability that if you are not showing, then that's a sign that there's something going askew under the hood. And so briefly, just like if we think about heart rate variability, like it's literally just like measuring the heart rate and then doing statistics on the time between beats. This is not sort of, let's see, heart rate variability. If anyone's ever seen like an EKG, which stands for echocardiogram, which starts with a C, don't ask me why. It's the timing between these beats that we're sort of thinking of as the heartbeat. And if anyone there's a lot of other things you can say about the other types of shapes that are going on here, which is literally below my level of analysis. But it's the variability between the actual like lubs and dubs of your heart that we associate with heart rate variability. Yeah, there we go. And so when we think about those numbers, like there's an inherent time scale there, because we're talking about like the statistics of like a timed thing. And you can imagine that if you looked, at some point in all of our lives, we will be asked by our doctors to wear a heart rate monitor for like 48 hours straight, and they will measure our heartbeat. And they'll look at things about the statistics of those heart rates to sort of look at various aspects of our nervous system. And you can imagine that at like the 24-hour time scale, you're going to see an effects of the fact that you tend to sleep at night versus you tend to like walk around in the daytime. So there's going to be a variability at that 24-hour scale where it tends to be faster for part of the day and then slower for another part of the day. But that's not the time, and that's an interesting time scale, but that's not the time scale that we're thinking about here. The time scale that we tend to associate with this conversation around the autonomic nervous system and these sort of trade-offs between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems happen on the scale of breaths. Because one of the sort of subtle aspects of the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system is that they, in a healthy, happy, sort of cheerfully functioning nervous system, the trade-off between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems happen every time you take a breath. And specifically, I always forget which one's which. When you inhale, your sympathetic system starts to wake up and your heart rate increases in the inhale part of your breath. And then when you exhale, your parasympathetic takes over and your heart rate slows down at that part of your breath. It's very hard to feel that. And again, it's at that layer when I try to sort of cue into my heart rate and tell if it's speeding up when I'm inhaling and slowing down when I'm exhaling. It's right at that layer where my ability to be aware of it is around the same, I think, skill, like the same power level as my ability to like lie to myself about my sensations. So I really have no idea if I'm actually feeling that or if I'm just like expecting it, so I am. But I think that whatever that sort of personal somatic journey might be, it's easier to do when my heart rate is elevated. So if I'm exercising, if my heart rate is beating fast in general, I can often kind of like feel like when I inhale, especially if I hold my breath, you can feel your heart rate kind of speeding up. And then when you exhale, you kind of feel it kind of slowing down. And so that conversation on heart rate variability is something that happens ideally at the scale of your breath. And so when they're looking for things, and typically when you hear people talk about things like heart rate variability, they tend to be talking about it on that time scale, and they're not talking about it on things like the 24-hour time scale or even like the multi-hour time scale. Although if you dig into this even a little bit, there's plenty that people have to say about heart rate variability at those kinds of time scales. And so this is where we get to this sort of little bit of jargon, which in my previous explorations of this area is this piece of jargon is as far as I can tell, the boundary layer between what I think of as like legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate science on this topic versus the woo-woo science on this topic, is the boundary between neurovisceral integration and polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory, if you see things talking about polyvagal, you're probably in woo town. And that doesn't mean that it's not useful in any sort of on a personal level, but I think that the term polyvagal is when they start talking about like, oh, there's like a ventral path and a dorsal path, and the ventral does this and the dorsal does that. And as far as I can tell, there is no actual scientific backing for that anatomical distinction between like different parts of the vagus nerve handling different parts of your regulatory system or whatever. So if you see the term polyvagal or dorsal ventral or something like that, not to say it's not useful, but just know that you're off the standard scientific story when you get to that space. Neurovisceral integration model or neurovisceral theory is the step back from that, which just says that what we might consider to be like a healthy, happy, nicely functioning relationship between a given, let's say, mammalian nervous system and the world at large can be measured and thought of as the ability of your nervous system to do a happy, healthy, and comfortable trade-off between those different aspects of your autonomic nervous system in a sort of smooth and careful and sort of like regular manner. So the ability of your body to transition from that sort of like arousal state that we associate with sympathetic and fight or flight and stuff like that, and transitioning into the rest and relax and digest and those parts of things, the ability to make those transitions smoothly from one to the other is what we tend to call neurovisceral theory, or even at a broader cut than that. It's just this idea that the neuron part, your nervous system, your neurons, your central nervous system, your brain, your whatever, has a connection to your viscera, like the lesser organs, and specifically your heart rate and your gut and your lungs, and that those things are connected to each other. And if you don't believe that, just know like you can think about something scary and your heart rate will go up. So there is a connection between like the most highfalutin abstractiness parts of your cognitive neural system and the lowest level, like we got to pump the goop through the body so that we can continue to like walk around and, not die. And so those parts are connected. And so so what I think of as neurovisceral and the way we've talked about the linguistics of these stuff, if you see two words which are squished together, you can replace the O with a slash, and that's kind of where you're at. So neurovisceral is sort of neural / visceral, where again, viscera is like the lesser organs, if you think about this in the way that don't think about the world like that, but you can imagine why one might. And so with that, I'm going to accelerate a little bit away from the sort of the goopier parts of neuroscience and into the more like socio-behavioral parts. And speaking specifically about like, this is where the trauma talk comes in, which I will try to do we'll try to sort of thread various lines there. So one of the main, I would say, again, roughly on the time scale of like my entry into neuroscience and then sort of like it's becoming much more prevalent these days, one of the ways that we have started to really think about the nervous system and the role of your central nervous system and like, why do you have a brain? Why do you have a chordate spinal cord? Like what role do those play in your actual ability to be a successful animal in the world? There is more and more of a belief that mostly what your nervous system is doing is predicting the future. That's mostly what your cognitive and neural and central nervous systems are for. Your job as an organism, as a creature, as a human, as a sort of cognitive agent, is to predict the future on the basis of noisy, out-of-date information about the current state of the world, combined with your memories and your histories and sort of like the lessons learned from previous interactions. And that's true on pretty much all time scales. So with the sort of the classic like throwing a ball and catching it, when I have so my senses are the fastest way that I get information from the world, and arguably the only way that I get information from the world. But even when I have a sensory experience, it's always something that happened after, because afterwards we learned/remembered that. So your sensory information happens after the event in question occurred. And then, so using that information, which is noisy, abstract, out of date, I can sort of make some predictions based off my previous experience, my sort of very wide and long array of previous experiences interacting with the world. And I can say, okay, with the sensations that I felt on my hand, coupled with the flashes of light I'm getting from my eyes, if I believe that if I send these series of motor commands to this arm, it will hit, the world will occur in the way that I expected it to, and the ball will land in my hand. And you can see, like, if you ever look at like babies trying to get around and try to like interact with their world, they're kind of like, especially when they're very young, they're kind of firing at random, and they have this kind of like tripping aspect of their behavior, and then when they actually get something that is kind of just like, holy shit, it worked. And so the way that our nervous system works, especially at that sort of developmental layer, is when we make a prediction where that works out like we expected it to, like we wanted it to, there is a reinforcement that occurs. If we want to talk about the goop again, it's thought to be associated with like the dopaminergic system. So I'm pretty sure if I do this with my body, I'll get the outcome that I want, and then the outcome that I want occurs, there's a dopaminergic release, and your literal dopaminergic is like the generation of dopamine. So it like you squirt all these like chemicals into the soup that basically have the effect of reinforcing whatever just happened was good. Let's reinforce that. Those neurons should be connected in that way because it leads to results that I like in my life. And this gets into this concept that I'm going to describe here, which is valence. So valence is just, again, root of value. It's kind of like it's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So good valenced things are things that are generally good. Bad valenced things are things that are generally bad. Like if I reached out to this and it had like, razor blades in it and I got cut, I don't like that, that's bad. Similarly, if I fire 15 milliseconds too late and I miss the thing and I drop it, that's a negative valence. And specifically, it's useful to think about that because notice I'm not talking anything there about scale. Like negative 0.1 is negative in the same way that negative 150,000 is negative. And similarly, 0.1 is positive, negative 1,000 is negative. The valence there is not a measure of the scale. and there's this relationship between when we make a prediction about the world and whether or not the prediction sort of works out in the way that we wanted it to, as to what the valence of that outcome is, defines whether our nervous system is like, that was great, let's do more of that, let's dump some dopamine and reinforce those connections, versus that was bad, I didn't like that, whatever just happened, we made some bad predictions, which means we made some mistakes, there were some errors occurred in the calculation, and we need to correct for those things at some level. So there's this central concept of prediction, and then this other concept of like the outcome of those predictions defining sort of how our nervous system will try to organize itself. And then I don't know why I put that out of order, but let's do that. Who cares? How are we doing on time? Doing okay on time. What was I going to say? Yeah, and I think I forgot to put this in here, so I'm not really sure what the order of operations should be here. But one of the things I've really noticed very recently is that concept of your nervous system mostly being about prediction has been in the perceptual motor literature for quite some time. Like it was already a little bit old hat by the time I started grad school. And I have started seeing that same kind of thinking coming into the way that we tend to think of emotions and the way that are sort of that aspect of our nervous system. And we tend, I think, naively, or sort of like the general naive relationship that we think of as emotions, we think of them as if they were sensations and as if they were reactions to the world and reactions to the way that the world is presenting itself to us. And I think there's obviously some aspect where that's going to be the case, like a alligator coming out of the water, that's scary, I am feeling fear. But there's also a predictive aspect of that emotion. Like I feel fear from that thing because I think that it will hurt me. I feel happy when I see cake because I think I'm going to eat cake. And so there's this interesting aspect of thinking of our emotional responses to the world as being less about immediate reactions to the state of the world and more about a sort of a vague prediction about what this available information is going to mean down the line at some time scale, possibly quick, possibly slow, and what I should do as a result of that. With the alligator coming at me, it's like I have to do alligator stuff very quickly, whereas with the cake showing up, it's like I need to do cake things at my own rate. And so you kind of see how there's that and typically speaking too, like when we think about things like the emotional parts of our brain and where emotions come from, we're talking about things like amygdala and those sort of like subcortical regions, which tend to live closer to the brainstem than they do to the cortex. And oftentimes emotions occur at the neurophysiological level in the form of like chemical dumps. Like there's some chemical gets released into the soup that we tend to associate with this, that, or the other emotion. And a lot of antidepressants and other forms of pharmaceuticals operate by either stimulating the dump of that, like you just consume that chemical, and so there's more of it floating around, so your emotions are handled that way, or you either eat synthetic forms or you sort of ask your body to dump those chemicals into your brain. So like MDMA happens because by telling your brain, dump all your happy juices. And so people tend to feel happy, and then they also tend to feel like sad after the fact because you dumped all your happy juices and you have to wait to sort of get more. And so this is where we sort of started getting into the trauma talk of the day. Because if you think about this sort of the combination of all of these things and the sort of the ANS and the sort of the trade-off of those different parts of your autonomic nervous system with this aspect of prediction and the aspect of your nervous system's main job being to predict the state of the future, this is where you get into the places where traumatic events, basically places where something things happen that you did not like can lead to these sort of like asynchronies between your ANS and sort of breakdowns of what we sort of call that neurovisual integration theory of like happy and healthy, whatever, depends on your ANS's ability to appropriately hot swap between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which you could sort of think of as like the ability to like relax when it's time to relax, because typically we don't have a problem with the other part. And let's see, where's I trying to go with this? Yeah, and also just before we get into there, just because we're getting into psychology spaces, we're going to talk, so PTSD is the letters we tend to associate with this, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post is after a traumatic event leads to a stress disorder. And I specifically want to talk about the term disorder in the context of the concept of valence. A disorder is any time things are in the way of your ability to live the life that you want to live. And also in the kind of the wooey, the sort of, you'll see a lot of conversations in this topic which are more or less informed by like empirical research. And you also hear a lot in just like the general ways that we have started to talk about these things in our sort of casual environments. And you sometimes hear people try to make a distinction between like capital T trauma with lowercase t trauma, where like lowercase t is like, I tried to drink the coffee and it was too hot and I burned my little lip. Whereas capital T is like, I got into a car accident and now I'm afraid of cars. And I think you see people sort of, I think, reasonably like upset that some people might feel like they're like watering down these like important concepts by associating the same kind of conversation to like the day-to-day, like sometimes things don't work out, like sorry, them's the beats, versus like things like PTSD, which can be very debilitating for people's lives. And I think that that's valid in some way, but also like we've talked about, nature is sort of goopy gradients and sort of shades of gray. And where we choose to draw the line between what is just normal relations to the world, like sorry kid, them's the breaks, get tough, that's the world, and that's like the healthy parts of stress that help you interact with the world, in a productive and a way that's effective for yourself. I think I'm less interested in trying to figure out exactly where to draw that line and more interested in trying to make sure that people know how to draw that line in ways that are appropriate for themselves. So I think that's why I want to think about the terms disorder as less of a thing that you're going to find in the DSM-5 saying, or 6 maybe now, like this is when it's a disorder, this is when it's just daily life, and more in the terms of like, it's a thing that you kind of get to choose. Like, is this something that is getting in the way of my ability to live my life as I want to, or is this just like, learning important life lessons and having the accrual of experiences that we eventually call things like wisdom and experience. So, up to you. And specifically, I think that when we think of disorder, it's often sort of like somehow the gears of the machine have slipped in some way. And the things that would normally operate as they would want to something is stuck. And so the machine cannot operate in the way that it would normally operate. And that's what we think of, names of disorders such as PTSD, and I'm also going to make a distinction here between PTSD, which is what we tend to think of as like, something really bad happened and now I'm having a hard time interacting with the world. So think like, it typically is like one really bad thing happened. Think like a car accident. So like bad event, and now you had a very scary experience where you became, came close to, serious injury, or maybe had a serious injury, and now it's affecting your ability to interact with the world. I would call that acute trauma, like one big bad thing, not cute, acute. And this is in distinction between a more, I think, subtle, newer sort of way of thinking about PTSD, which is we tend to call complex PTSD, which is a different type of behavior that we tend to associate with living in a world that is a general long-term exposure to a generally unsafe environment. So less one big car accident and more like living in sort of a, maybe like low-grade child abuse, or like living in like food insecure environments where you grow up as a child and you can't always get food when you're hungry. There's no one big thing that's bad enough to like warrant like, oh yeah, and this was the event that I'm having to deal with. It's more like living long term with like a low-grade harm that sort of pervades everything. And I don't know if you can perhaps think of any people or groups of people who might experience the world that is, generally speaking, in a low-grade way, unsafe and filled with like small sub-threshold traumas that sort of never quite cross the barrier of something you might be able to label specifically, but nonetheless become integrated into the way that you view the world. I can't think of any, but maybe you can. And so just a real quick shout out to like some pop sci books that I have that sort of look like this, I would say the start of my own exploration of this into the space. The classic one is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by James Van Der Kolk, which it doesn't really make that distinction between acute and complex, but it is tends to be about acute PTSD, written by James Van Der Kolk, who was one of the people who wrote the DSM definition of PTSD and got it sort of put into the common vernacular. It gets a lot of flack these days, I think for good reason, because it's like, I think the main complaint is like, it is not written in a trauma-informed way. It talks about like people's bad experience, and like, it's like, it's hard to recommend it to people who've experienced bad effects, because it's like, it has like sort of like, let's talk about the things that people may have literally come to the book to be able to process in like a very graphic way. So that's not really great. And it's not that bad. It's just kind of like reasonable complaints. But it also tends to be like very sort of like dry academic. It's very information dense, which is good, but I still recommend it, but I put these caveats on it. Also, apparently Van Der Kolk is like a bit of a creep, I think. I don't know the details there, but in the way that most older academics with some degree of notoriety become at some level. But still, books are books. Then the one that I think of, that I tend to recommend first to people, is another one called What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu, which she is a person who grew up in like an abusive childhood environment, and she became like a journalist. So she wrote, it's much more like memoir-y, talking about her own sort of journey to like understanding what PTSD is like, and sort of like different treatments that she did, and sort of like integrating it into her own life. So it's way less information dense, but it's kind of like, it feels a little more modern and aware. But it is very, but I don't think, so the Stephanie Fu book came later, so she does talk about complex PTSD more specifically, whereas the Body Keeps the Score, it just talks about PTSD, and it doesn't really make that distinction between the two things. But yeah, so in the context of the kind of stuff we've been talking about, if we think about the sort of the combination of the role of your nervous system primarily to be about predicting the future and integrating information and experiences to allow us to understand the state of the world and the appropriate set of behaviors we should have in response to the state of the world, you can see where things like big traumatic events or even low-grade, long-term traumatic experiences can lead to kind of like a slipping of the gears there, and specifically in the ability of your body to appropriately transfer between the sort of the fight or flight autonomic, the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state, and the more like resty, relaxy parasympathetic state. And because basically your body is your body, your nervous system, your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, your autonomic nervous system is very sensitive to the outcome of the predictions that we make. And we humans in general, tend to be far more risk averse than we are reward celebratory. So like if you ask someone, would you rather have $10 or a 10% chance of making $100? Rationally, numerically, those are the same offer, but we massively prefer $10 rather than the possibility of $100, just because we tend to be more risk averse. One thing I like to say is like, it would be a pretty shitty visual system that puts equal weight to everything in your visual field and notices the things that aren't tigers at the same level that it notices the things that are tigers. So we tend to be very risk averse, and because of that, we have the possibility, or seems like maybe the natural tendency, to overweight bad experiences in helping us understand how we should interact with the world. Because if you have a situation where, you are in a car accident, or you're confronted with two doors, one is blue, one is green, and you open the green door and you get punched in the face, you open the blue door, you get cake and candy. There is an after the fact kind of, speaking metaphorically and poetically, after the fact, your nervous system is going to do the math of, did we make a good prediction? If we did, we should reinforce it. Or did we make a bad prediction and did it lead to us being harmed or put into danger? And if we did have a situation where we thought we were safe and then we found a situation where we were harmed in some way, your body's going to start looking for things that you missed and things that you should have noticed before, and so that you can start thinking, oh, I should have noticed that car was turning. I should have noticed that the door was green, and green means people are going to punch you when you open the door. I don't know what that is. And so what can happen is what we tend to call hypervigilance, where you sort of, because oftentimes because the world is cruel and capricious, oftentimes there wasn't a thing that you could have noticed, or at least not something that you really should have noticed given your experience. And so what will happen is your body will just like reach out for stuff. And so sometimes like the lesson that your nervous system might learn was, I let my guard down and that was the mistake. And so what can lead to this kind of like dysregulation of nervous system, where your body might sort of associate being in a state of calm and relaxed, especially if you're around other people, especially if you're in like an environment that, is in the world and so is sort of available for danger. And so the sympathetic nervous system might be unwilling to give up the reins at times when it needs to. And that's where you can, and it's thought that you could sort of measure that in the terms of heart rate variability, where if you measure someone's heart rate and look for those transitions of high speed versus low speed heart rate on the scale of breaths, you might not see that because the sympathetic nervous system is holding on too tight, and the parasympathetic system doesn't get the chance to do the slowing down that's supposed to happen. And then you can imagine how that same type of, I won't say inability, but difficulty in trading off between high state arousal versus like low state relaxation could lead to problems generally in health. Think about like that, your gut's doing its job. Think about being able to sleep through the night, and also think about being able to like interact with people around you and, let your guard down around other people, which is where a lot of the good parts of life tend to come from. And so that is the kind of, that hypervigilance can be something that is sort of one of the consequences of traumatic experiences, and specifically, and then sort of like, so then the question then becomes from the perspective of people who care about humans having happy lives, is like, if that happens, when that happens, because unfortunately, like, the world is rough and we will encounter difficulties, how do we sort of try to bring things back to baseline? And what might work there? And one thing that I also want to mention, because I'm running out of time, I think we're on a good path, but I wanted to sort of point out that there is another concept which I'm not going to talk much about, which is the concept of resilience, and the fact that not everybody that has a bad negative experience results in disordered autonomic regulation and stuff. Some people are able to bounce back, and sort of what is it that defines or that can help us differentiate one versus the other. And oftentimes it's a question of baseline, a question of how many experiences have you had that show you that it is safe to relax and put your guard down, and how likely are you to have experienced cases where that's not the case. And that's if you think about that in terms of your life and your development, that is the reason why it is so important to try to protect children and sort of try to teach children that they can let their guard down. And because if you think about the blue versus green door, if you have a lifetime of experience with doors of all sorts of colors, and you open a green one and you get punched in the face, you've opened enough green doors in your life that you know that it's not the door that's the problem. Now it's just, I've opened 1,000 green doors and only that one is the one where I got hit. But if I just started opening doors in my life and I've maybe never encountered doors of any color, and I open a green door and I get hit in the face, for the rest of my life, like 100% of at that point, 100% of my experience tells me that green doors are unsafe. And so you might develop a lifelong aversion to green doors, even when it's not appropriate. And I think one of the things that tends to come out of this literature, and it's discussed at length in The Body Keeps the Score, is really how critical it is for us to think about giving specifically young children the experience of safety and comfort in that early phase of their life, and the long-term consequences and effects that can come up. Not insurmountable. They're not, children of bad experiences are not doomed, but the early effects are going to be weighted more heavily than the later. Early experiences are always going to be weighted more heavily than later experiences, because in that early phase of your life, you have less experiences to fall back on. And there's this kind of mode of thinking that the world will always have, the only way that we will ever have a world we deserve, optimistically, is if we have 3 generations in a row where every child gets to experience stability and comfort and care for the first, let's say, 18 years of their life. 3 generations in a row, which is because epigenetics and all that. And so in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk just about that the disordered hypervigilant response is this. You can get into the states where nothing is safe, the world isn't safe, I cannot let my guard down, I cannot appropriately rest and relax. And in extreme cases, that can be always, and in the case of interpersonal trauma, which unfortunately is a lot of it, you can have that effect around other people and just having a very difficult time being calm and being relaxed around other human beings, which is both the most appropriate response that you can imagine, and also one of the things that can be really diminishing for your ability to sort of live a happy, healthy, productive, not productive, let's say effective. Productive is capitalism, effective is internal motivation. And so, again, this is out of my field, and I'm certainly not a therapist or a counselor or anything like that. But I do find it very interesting that a lot of the treatments and therapies that we tend to associate with helping people get the gears back into sync with each other has this. There's this recurring pattern of tasks that cut across that full hierarchy of your nervous system, and trying to engage your volitional control systems onto parts of your body, your nervous system, that are as close to that low level as you can get it. Because you can't just decide to speed up your heart rate and slow down your heart rate, but you can decide to hold your breath and take long breaths and take slow breaths. So there's this concept of the physiological sigh, which I can't tell. I think that's legit. I don't know if that. It's associated with Dan Huberman, who, as far as I can tell, is a legit scientist, but I see him too often to trust him. It's kind of you find your way in front of a camera too much for me to really trust you there. But he does this research, and that kind of you will see this, you'll feel this in your own life. You'll see it in other people where he's kind of it's just that kind of that feeling of an additional breath and then a deep sigh. And that is associated with some empirical basis with a reset. You're typically it's you're in an aroused, some heightened state, then you go, and then it's kind of your body kind of releasing a lot of tension, a lot of relaxing. You'll notice it in yourself, and every time you do that, ask the question, why was I just cranked up? What was going on just now that was just going on? And then now that I'm past that point, what can I experience of that? This starts getting to the place of like the boundaries between like benevolent interaction between humans and like Machiavellian sort of like queuing into people. If you're ever in an argument with somebody, if you're ever in like a difficult conversation with someone, first of all, try not to get too angry and upset, and try to like calm things down and take a pause, and just notice when they do that. Like, because you'll be in the and then they'll be like, and then that's the point where you be like, that's when you can sort of engage more empathetically with the person, because they have hypothetically just left that high arousal state and sort of entered into a more resty, relaxy kind of space. And you can game it. You can cheat yourself, because your nervous system, your body, your internal systems are brilliant, and in the same way of most things that are brilliant, they're also dumb as hell. And so your body and your mind and your brain will lie to you, it will trick you, it will say things that are wrong, but you can sling that straight back and lie just as hard. Because you can, and so there's all sorts of things like you can, so like if you're trying to like get yourself to relax, and we know that breathing in tends to ramp up the sympathetic and breathing out tends to ramp up the parasympathetic, just take a quick, and then like just breathe in quickly and then exhale slowly, and that's just, you're just gaming the system there. I also have a personal fascination with eye movements in this conversation as well, because sort of, as we've talked about in many cases throughout this semester, and what I find to be like a very similar way that our breathing is on that boundary of volitional versus autonomic control, our eye movements are in a similar kind of space where you will make, tens and hundreds of thousands of eye movements every day, the vast, vast, vast majority of which are not volitionally controlled. It's just your central nervous system grabbing visual information from the places that some lower reach of your nervous system wanted the information from. And we can control that at some level, not all the time, but we can engage through some effort. We can grab that handle and sort of control things that way. And there's treatments like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitivity and reprogramming or something like that, that involve making patterned eye movements like back and forth as a way to kind of like take some control back over your central nervous system. And then also like naming and noticing the sort of like, you'll see this in like somatic therapies where it's like naming the emotion and sort of like pointing to it in your body, and sort of like the kind of like engaging like the linguistic parts of your brain, which is like the most like high level abstract, like non-biological parts that exist. So putting a name on a feeling is similarly like reaching across these like, eons of the phylogenetic tree. And a lot of therapies just kind of have that nature of sort of like reaching from the top down to the bottom and sort of like resting control that way. And so in the last 2 minutes, I sort of want to thinking about this in terms of having a body, having a nervous system, living in this sort of weird meat puppet that has all these different systems trading off on each other, some of which you can be aware of, some of which you can control, some of which you cannot. And thinking about it in the context of like, I've had, dogs and cats and pets in my life, and cats are kind of like having weird alien roommates that kind of like live and operate in the same space, and like we like each other, but we can't really communicate in the same way. And I think that there's like parts of your nerve, like your gut kind of feels like that. Like it's there, it's you can operate in a certain way that gets certain behavior, but you can't directly control it in the same way that you can control your muscular systems, your eye movement systems. Dogs, on the other hand, is more like having an externalized aspect of your nervous system. They actively look to you to figure out how they should behave, and you can control their behaviors in a much more direct way. It's an independent being for sure, but you can say, calm down, you can pet it, you can, if it barks, it looks at you. And you can have that sort of a much more directed conversation with that externalized nervous system than you can with something like a cat. And so I think that when we think about, there's this concept in neuroscience of the homunculus, which is the homunculus is the thing that you think that you are naively. It's the feeling of like, that you're like in a little driver's seat in your brain, and there's some externalized part of you that can look and examine the body that you're in and exert some kind of control over it. But that doesn't exist. There is not some additional smaller piece inside of you. That internal small man in your brain, small human in your brain, that's just you. That's just the system observing itself. And that kind of interaction is something that's kind of very philosophically fraught. And so in the last, I still have some number of seconds left, Wittgenstein is a philosopher of language from like one of the progenitors of like our modern theories of like philosophy of science. And he talked a lot about like the impossibility of language and the impossibility of like conveying human thought through language, and this sort of sad reality that you can never fully express a human thought. You can only approximate it over time. He talked a lot about described it as like having a beetle in a box. And I have this box and I have this beetle in it, and I can try to explain and describe what that is, what the beetle is like, and it's green, it's got these little things on its head, and I could talk about that for 1,000 years, but you'll never be able to actually see it. You'll never get the same picture of the beetle as you could as if I could show it to you, but I can't. And in the same way, I realized, now I'm out, that in the same way that nobody else can ever see the beetle that you have in your box, you can never see the box. And so I think that to really engage in the strange impossible task of trying to know yourself and know your body, it's a combination of being able to work to the impossible task of describing your internal state, but also an aspect of like listening and hearing and sort of seeking help to actually get the full picture, which you can never actually get from this first person perspective, which is all we really have. So yeah, because if you're gonna be doomed to push an impossible boulder up a hill forever, you might as well have company. So, all right, that's it. Thanks for the class. Have a good break, and I will see you